one thing that I want to stress about price elasticity are basically names. So we define the concept of elasticity as the percentage change of a variable, right? That could be quantity demanded or quantity supply, as the outcome of a change of another variable. In this case, the prices, or could be income. So price elasticity of demand will be how much, right, the quantity changes in percentage terms, right, given a 1% change in prices. So you will expect the price elasticity to be negative, just because the law of demand tells you there is a negative relationship between prices and quantities. So the responsiveness of demand for an individual product. A demand which is flat, horizontal, will be called perfectly price elastic. Right? So that's the extreme, in which there's quite a lot of price sensitivity. Right? On the other hand, right, if the demand, right, is steeper, then the price elasticity goes down. Changes in quantity are not affected that much by changes in prices. So, for example, that will be an inelastic demand. That's what we would call it, an inelastic demand. And that will be, say, for example, the demand for petrol, right? Because changes in the price of petrol will not induce big changes in the quantity demanded of petrol, because we cannot substitute out for, say, other available means of putting kind of energy to the oil or diesel if the car is petrol. When we have more substitutes, we end up having more price sensitivity. Remember the concept, the example of the soft drinks, right? Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and the relationship they had in terms of being kind of very similar goods. Changes in the price of one will lead to, right, consumers moving or purchasing more of the other, right, and hence having a big impact on the quantity demanded, right, of the good that its price has changed. And that will be an elastic demand. So what do we learn is that the elasticity is related to the slope, of course, but more importantly, right, because it's related to the slope, and the slope is a way of measuring the price responsiveness, one has to ask what determines that price responsiveness, and hence one can conclude that the amount of complements and the amount of substitutes will be an important determinant of the price elasticity. Right? So the price elasticity is our measure of price responsiveness. It's much better than the slope. Right? And then you have to ask the question, what determines price elasticity? What determines that a demand is inelastic or elastic? Well, there are several features. One important one is the amount of substitutes this good has. How easy can the consumer swap between goods? Here's an example of a change in quantities and a change in prices, right? So the inelastic demand, for example, the firm A, right, for a reduction in, say, the price of 4 units, you will have an increase in the demand, in the quantity demanded only of 10 units. While a reduction for firm B, which is a price elastic demand, has a reduction of 1 unit in the price, leads to 50 units, an increase in 50 units in the quantity demanded. So here you can see graphically what I mean about the responsive of quantities to price changes. Now, this is important as well because when we're looking at the forces of supply and demand, right, any shock, any increase that the demand or the supply has, right, that moves the economy to a different equilibrium, right? Now I want you guys to think about the competitive case, right, in which these market forces, right, suppliers and consumers are maximizing on one hand, their profits, on the other hand, their welfare, and they are trying to, get the good they want at the correct price, or the good or sell the good at the correct price. So that situation could be described as in an equilibrium as a point A, the intersection between demand and supply. Suppose now there is a change in supply, right? So for some reason, inputs become more expensive, right? Or if we're talking about a manufacturing company that uses natural resources, well, there is a negative shock to the supply of natural resources, right? So the supply of the good decreases. That, of course, we know will induce a price increase, right? Will induce a price increase. Now, how much of a price increase? That will depend on the slope of the demand, and hence on the elasticity of the demand, right? Remember that effectively what we're doing here is we're moving the supply along the demand. We're moving from point A to point B. The demand has not changed. So how fast is the supply moving, right? And hence the outcome for prices and quantities will depend on how steep or flat is the demand. Is the supply. The demand. Here's the case in which the demand is pretty flat, right? You could see that the quantity demanded and the prices will be different, right, from the blue demand, which is steeper, right? So a more inelastic demand, a steeper demand, will induce smaller changes in quantity, higher changes in prices. A flatter demand, a more elastic demand, will induce, given shocks of supply, right, will induce a smaller change in prices and a bigger change in quantities. Right? That's the idea. And that's where you can see it. Now, let me quickly tell you why we care about the elasticity of demand from the point of view of the firm. And a good way of doing this is by looking at total expenditures. So you as a firm, right, would like to know how price sensitive are your consumers. So suppose you are in a situation in which you're evaluating whether to change the price or not. Right? This could be because of competition. This could be because you developed a new technology that could improve, right? But that costs a bit more, and you want to pass on that to the consumer. This could be because the government introduced a tax to your good or inputs, and that increased the cost of production, and you want to see if you can pass it on to consumers. Now, total expenditures here, suppose you are selling 3, consumers are buying 3, this is on aggregate, of course, at a price of 2, leads to a total revenue of 6 million in this case. It's just the area, the blue area, this graph there. Very simple. Now, suppose we're looking at a situation, right, in which the demand is rather elastic. So you start, right, selling at 4, and consumers buying 20, right? You have a revenue of 80, right? A similar situation as before. Right? But now, suppose that you want to evaluate an increase in price, as I said, but this increase in price is just of 1 unit. So I want to increase for, the price for £1. So I want to increase the price to 5, and the question is, well, how much will that lead to a reduction or an increase in expenditures? In principle, you will say, well, if the law of demand holds, right, and consumers are willing to buy now less at a higher price, well, surely if I increase the price, right, my total expenditures will decrease because consumers are consuming less, right? Well, not quite, because it depends on how price sensitive are consumers. If they're willing to, not cut the amount demanded of your good for a given price hike, then your expenditures might increase, right? Because proportionally, they are reducing less the quantity demanded with respect to the increase in price. That would be the case of an inelastic demand. If the demand were to be elastic, then price sensitivity is high. And you know that a small increase in prices will lead to a massive decrease in quantities. And that's one particular case. Increase on 1 unit in prices from 4 to 5 leads to a reduction in quantity demanded by 50%, from 20 to 10, right? So you started with 80 of revenue. You end up by increasing the price by 1 unit with a revenue of 50 million, right? 50 million. So you basically, right, are reducing your income, the expenditures of consumers, and hence what do you receive by selling this good, right, by around 50%. A bit more, of course, because 50% will be 40. It's a bit more. So price elasticity, right, is important because it tells us about how consumers are going to react to price changes that we potentially are going to try to introduce into the market. Could be for many reasons, as I described, right? If consumers have other goods to substitute out the good that I'm selling to them, right? Think of that will be a demand that is pretty elastic, right? Consumers will be price sensitive, and changes in prices will lead to big changes in expenditures, and hence on the income received by the firm. A small increase in prices will have a massive reduction in the income consumers are spending on this good, and hence on the income the firm is receiving. Here's the case of an inelastic demand, just to point out that one has the opposite case in a graphical way, right? So you started with 80 again, but the demand is now steeper, inelastic, right? An increase in the price by 4, so I'm doubling, right? The price leads to, right, a small decrease in quantities, in percentage terms. Okay. So here you can see that revenue actually rises, right? Revenue rises. So you can do just quickly the math, right? And you can see that revenue rises to 90. Okay. So situations that are extreme, that are sometimes useful, right, is where the demand is perfectly inelastic. I mean, in a way, remember, what do firms want? Firms want, through marketing, to change consumer preferences such that consumers are less price sensitive, right? That will be a great environment for them, right? Changing through advertisement, how consumers view your good, and hence how they react to price changes, and hence the price responsiveness. You will like your demand, the demand you face for your good, to be as price inelastic as possible. This is one case when it is totally inelastic, right? And you can see that, basically, this is the extreme, of course, but everything is prices. Everything, you don't change quantities, everything is prices. And this will be the perfectly elastic demand in which all the movement occurs in quantities, right? There's other versions of this unit elastic demand, which implies that at every point around this curve, the elasticity is the same, right? Let me stress this, and I want to wrap up the concept of elasticity with this, is that there are important determinants of the price elasticity of demand and supply, right? In both cases, expectations are important. In both cases, the income is important. However, in supply, a crucial aspect is the time horizon, right? Is the time horizon. So when you start producing, right, a crucial thing is, as we said, technology. What is the technology available to you as a firm? As this technology evolves, right, potentially you could end up having much more substitutes, much more competition to your good. Again, take the smartphones, right? When Apple started introducing smartphones to the market, then Apple saw quite a lot of competition from several other providers, manufacturers. Right? But that took a while. Right? So Apple was the first, and then a bunch of other firms came in. Right? So you could see that over time, right, the elasticity of supply for them, right, how price sensitive they are to changes in price, so how sensitive they are to changes in prices, has evolved, right, over time because of technological progress. But that also has a knock-on effect on the elasticity of demand, because that introduced more substitutes, right? So changes in prices of Apple, right, to the iPhone will also induce now more changes in quantity, right, than before, because there's more competition, there's more substitutes, right? So over time, right, consumers change the elasticity of demand because of the substitutes they could appear in the market, but that comes about because of technological progress, right? And that, of course, affects the elasticity of supply as well. Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up that with the concept of elasticity. You're going to be doing elasticity over your class exercises this week. This is an important concept, so please make sure you read the correct chapters and master this concept. Now, what I want to do the rest of the lecture is to think a little bit about the decisions consumers make. And up to now, we've been always thinking about a situation in which consumers take decisions under an environment which is pretty much certain to them. I didn't discuss about uncertainty. However, uncertainty is crucial. We live in an uncertain world in which we face risks, and we have to make decisions dealing with those risks. So a crucial aspect of these decisions, or for us to understand the decisions of consumers under uncertainty, is to understand, again, their preferences. Right? So I bang this again, consumers' preferences. Right? So we want to understand the preferences. And we want to understand what type of consumers, right, are more risk-loving, are more risk-averse, or really don't care much about risk. Right? In practice, we all care about risk. Right? On our day-to-day behavior, we're pretty much risk-averse. Right? Of course, there are situations in which we are a bit more risk-loving, right? But when it takes, say, on day-to-day dealings, we will end up, realizing we're pretty risk-averse, right? Now, to understand risk aversion, let me go a little bit further into the concept of demand, right? And the concept of utility. So as I said, consumers want to maximize their welfare, their happiness, right? We're going to call that utility. So we're going to use what is called the Utilitarian Theory, right, to start measuring some sort of happiness, some sort of welfare for consumers, right? Now, when we start thinking about utility, right, of course you have to think about, wait, this is not really money, right? It's kind of units of happiness. And utility, right, or how we measure our utility, how we value things to a certain extent, as I said, is independent across us, right? So it's idiosyncratic. We have our own preferences. We might have similar preferences to others, so they're not really completely independent, but similar preferences among others of same peer group, same cultural background, whatever, right? But the crucial thing is that to get a grasp on how to understand consumer behavior, we need to introduce some measure of welfare. We're going to use that. We're going to use utility, right? So utility is derived from satisfaction of a purchase. It's not the purchase in itself, right? It's the satisfaction I get from it. It's not consuming on its own right, it's the satisfaction that I get out of consuming. So this concept is crucial. Why? Because if I give you 10 pounds, right, then an economist will think not, well, this 10 pounds in themselves will not make you happier. Will it make you happier? Will it be that this 10 pounds allows you to buy something, right? And you will have satisfaction, you will get satisfaction out of that purchase, right? So these 10 pounds, right, need to be put through your utility, right, to understand how much you value them, right? So that concept, right, now needs to be formalized a little bit, right? Needs to be formalized a little bit. And there is where we use, again, math. Right? To understand that transformation of, say, money into utilities, what we need is a utility function that relates, right, quantities or money or whatever into utility, right? And this utility function arises from preferences. Again, all boils down to preferences again, right? So how, in this case, what are your preferences with respect to risk or towards risk will determine your utility, right? Will determine your utility. Okay. So just to give you a brief example of this concept of utility in a bit more detail, right? Think of a consumer making choices, right? Now, this consumer makes choices, right, to maximize, now we know, his or her own utility, right? Now, utility will be, as I said, a formal concept, a function, right, that basically gets all these consumption goods, the quantity you want to consume of good X or good Y or good Z or whatever you have it, right, and ends up giving you, look, if you consume 3 units of good X, 2 units of good Y, that's the utility you're going to get, right? It's a kind of a black box. You put in quantities, gives you out utility, but this black box, of course, has a foundation, your preferences, right? Now, but all the decisions you made, right, or you make, are not necessarily based purely on, utility, in the sense that you want to maximize your utility, fine, but you have certain constraints. Those constraints are pretty much given by your budget. Right? You have a certain amount of money you have, say your wages, your savings, right? And you need to use them wisely. So what do I mean when we use that money wisely is to try to maximize your utility. Try to choose a consumption bundle that maximizes your utility and satisfies your budget constraint, right? Now, a key concept behind utility is that because you want to maximize your utility given your budget constraint, right, you will always hit the budget constraint, right? Because utility implies as well that more is better. You will consume more of something and your utility will increase, right? Now, it will increase, and we, I think, discussed this maybe the first week, at a decreasing rate. So there will be potentially a point of satiation. You say, stop, I don't want more of this good. But however, the concept of more is better, right, leads you to purchase at your budget constraint. So what is a budget constraint? A budget constraint is what I graphed there. on the case of two goods, goods 1 and 2, right? Goods that are sold in the market at a given price, you cannot change, right? Those prices you cannot change. You're a small consumer, right? You cannot change the prices of the goods, so you take them as given. You go to Tesco's, for example, you don't start bargaining with a lady in the counter. Look, can I buy this pint of milk a little bit cheaper? No, you just take that price as given, and you buy it. In other circumstances, you might bargain. For example, your wages. You might bargain over your wages. But typically, on consumption goods, you don't bargain. So given the prices and given your income, right, you can figure out how much you can allocate, right, in terms of expenditures to each good. And that's pretty simple, right? That's using the concept of real versus nominal. For example, if you have 100 pounds a week, and there's two goods, right? One, say, good X is priced at 2 pounds, good Y is priced at 10 pounds, right? How much good Y you can buy with all your income, right? You divide, 100 over 10, right? 10 units. If how much money, I can afford, how many goods I can buy of units I can buy of good X, divide 100 over 2, right? 50, right? So that's the concept of real income, right? How much goods your money is worth. Right? Okay, given that, you know as well how you're going to be able to, change the rate of change between X and Y. Right? The exchange rate between X and Y. Suppose I have only these two goods, and I want to increase the consumption of Y. How much would I give up of X to consume Y? Right? So you're in your budget constraint. You're spending your 100 pounds, right? And that will give you a combination, any combination. So I will start with the easiest combination. I will consume all of my money in good Y. So here, good 2, right? So that involves what? Basically getting 100 over 10, right? 10 units of good Y, and 0 of good X, right? So that's using all my budget. So I'm on my budget constraint. But of course, that's not a very interesting situation because we kind of love variety. We don't typically use our money on one good. We buy a basket of goods. So, right, you have to figure out, suppose I want to increase the consumption of good X, but still be in my budget constraint, on my budget constraint. So what is the rate of exchange? I will have to increase, say, by 1 unit, right, my consumption of X, but that implies giving up so many units of good Y, right? So what is the rate of exchange? Is the price relationship between the two. Is the relative price between the two, right? The relative price between the two. If I want to increase my consumption of X, I have to pay 2 pounds, right? I have to pay 2 pounds. And I have to actually, get those 2 pounds somewhere and still be in my budget constraint. So what I have to do is consume a little bit less of Y. How much less? Right? How much less? 2 over 10. Right? 2 over 10. The relationship between the price of X and over the price of Y will tell you how much, right, is that relative price, and allows you to understand how much you will be able to exchange good Y for 1 unit of good X. The same logic as your exchange rates, right, that we are all very familiar with. When you have 1 pound and you want to turn it into €1 or $1 or whatever you have it, right, you always figure out, okay, what is the exchange rate? 1 pound buys me this. Right? You have a given budget. Say I want to 100 pounds. You want to now change it to some of it to dollars, some of it to euros, and you always are looking at for the exchange rate. That's the same concept I'm using here. Relative prices are nothing more than exchange rates. Right? But here, what is important is those prices are given to you. This is a market situation in which you are a price taker, right? And you are basically saying, okay, the market is giving me this price ratio. I cannot do nothing about that. What I only can do is maybe work harder and increase my income, right? But for prices, I cannot do anything. So the rate of exchange of prices is given by the market. Your income, suppose it's given, and given these two pieces, we have our budget constraint, right? We have our budget constraint. Of course, if the price changes of a good or both goods, right, not in the same proportion, then you will have movements of this budget constraint. For example, if the price of good X increases, right, from 2 to 10, what do we have? We have now a price ratio of 1. Before it was 2 over 10, right? So what has happened to the price ratio? The price ratio has increased. So if we are measuring it through a linear function like this one, we will expect, right, the the budget constraint to become steeper, right? So the flatter line, right, the dotted outer line is the flatter one, right, will be a situation in which, for example, you have a price ratio of 2 over 10. As the price of X increases, you end up moving, right, to a steeper, the solid black line, and even steeper, right, the inner dotted line, right? So you're increasing the numerator, right? So you're making the fraction steeper and steeper. So higher and higher makes the slope steeper and steeper. So this is important, as I said, because you're taking this as given, and then what do I do with this? Well, I have to then figure out how to maximize my utility with this. How to maximize my utility with this. But now, in your utility, because that comes from preferences, right, a different story goes on. There is also the concept of rate of exchange. But this rate of exchange is given by your preferences. How much are you willing, right, to give up consumption, and hence the utility, right, of having this good versus the other, X versus Y. So now when you start thinking about preferences, you start thinking about utility, and now because you can actually put some numbers to it, you can start thinking about an exchange rate in terms of utility, right? Now because we're looking at exchange rates, it's also the relationship between the utility of one versus the utility of the other. But now, the trick is to realize that it is that extra unit that I want to buy what matters. So it's not the utility of buying 10 units, it's what is the utility of buying 1 more unit of X versus giving up 1 more unit of Y. Okay? It's always this marginal increase, this extra one. Right? When I was doing the budget constraint, right, I was saying, suppose I want to consume 1 more unit of X, right? But the prices are given. So it doesn't matter how many units of X I buy, I have to pay the same price, right? However, when it comes to utility, then that changes, right? Because the first unit of X might induce an increase in utility, right, that is higher than the second unit of X. That is what I refer to. Utility increases with consumption, but at a decreasing rate, because you get satiated. Right? So what do you have is then you have 2 exchange rates. One is the price ratio, and the other one is the ratio between marginal utilities of good X versus good Y. Right? So when the two are equal, right? When the two are equal, turns out that that's the point in which you want to consume. And that's the point that you want to consume because you maximize your utility there. Right? So think about it. A ratio of that sort say, I'm going to call marginal utility of X, right? Over price of X, right? And the marginal utility of Y over price of Y, right? This is nothing more than the marginal utility of X over marginal utility of Y equals price of X over price of Y. So the exchange rate of prices versus the exchange rate of your preferences, right? What is this saying? So what I want to convey here is why you're going to stop here. Because suppose you said, okay, I'm going to consume 1 unit of X, 1 extra unit of X. This will give me a marginal utility, which what I care about, right? I care about utility. So this will give me an increasing my utility of this quantity. This is a number, by the way. Right? I'm just calling it marginal utility, say, whatever, right? But what I care also is about is, well, but I'm going to spend some money on that increasing consumption of good X, right? It's not comes for free, it comes as a price, right? So if I increase the consumption of X, I'll pay, right, say £2, and I will increase my utility by, say, 5, right? Okay? So let's keep that in mind. So let's put 5 here and 2, right? On the other hand, I have a price of Y of 10, right? And I said, okay, what is my marginal utility of reducing the consumption of Y? By increasing X and being on my budget constraint, I must be reducing the consumption of Y. So I'm reducing it by something, right? I'm reducing it by something. Now, suppose the reduction of the units of Y involve a marginal utility of, say, 1. Right? Which is, I'm making it such that this is the case. Right? The marginal utility over the price of X is greater than the marginal utility over the price of Y. But why I'm doing this? Because I want you guys to see that if this is the case, if I said, look, if I increase the consumption of Y, I have to pay 2, and I get a marginal utility of 5, right? And I have to give up a unit of Y, or I have to give units of Y up. Well, the price of each of these units, right, is 10. The marginal utility is 1. Seems like a pretty good deal to me to start increasing the units of X, because I get more satisfaction for the money that I spent. Right? I get a higher utility increase for the money that I spent. So I will start increasing my consumption of X. But increasing my consumption of X, as I said, implies satiation. So the marginal utility goes down, right? And this ratio goes down to the point in which the two are equal. And when the two are equal, then I don't have any incentive to continue purchasing more X. Right? The same exercise could be done if you think about it the other way. Right? Here, I will be reducing my consumption of X. My marginal utility goes up. The prices, remember, are fixed. And hence, this ratio increases because the marginal utility increases. And hence, we end up in a position in which we want to consume, right, good X and good Y in a situation in which the ratio, marginal utility ratio, equals the price ratio. That is, the exchange rate of your preferences equals the exchange rate of the market. Right? That's basically the logic. Now, this is why we end up having situations, as I said, on our budget constraint, and we are in our budget constraint. Where we end up, those blue dots will be determined by this ratio. Will be determined by this ratio, right? With this, I wanted to really stress the importance of the utility concept and how consumers make choices. Of course, this is all consistent with what I said before, right? Firms want to change preferences. Preferences, you know, are related to utility. Utility is related to consumption behavior, right? And, of course, consumption behavior is related to demand, right? Is related to demand. How? Well, because suppose the price of Y is constant, right? And I decide to do the exercise of changing price of X, right? A change in the price of X will induce what? Right? Say, suppose I reduce the price of X, right? If I reduce the price of X, I change this. And I make the marginal utility, the ratio of the marginal utilities bigger than the ratio of prices. What will that induce? This concept, yeah? What will that induce? That will induce a higher consumption of good X, right? Such that this is greater than this now, right? Because the price has been reduced, right? So the denominator reduces, the whole fraction goes up, right? So you start consuming more X. So what do you have is a decrease in the price induces an increase in the quantity demanded, such that we achieve again this situation. So you see how it all kind of fits together with our concept of the law of demand, right? So our consumer behavior, our optimal behavior, based on maximizing utility, right, given prices and a budget constraint, right, is completely consistent with the law of demand. As a matter of fact, that is how we derive the demand, right? And that's the real underpinnings of why we say the demand is affected by our preferences, our expectations, our income, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to skip that. And using these concepts, right, we can now think about, well, how these decisions are made under uncertainty. Right? How these decisions are made under uncertainty. So I'm going to point out, as I said, for 3 attitudes towards risk. The first one is risk aversion. So you are averse to risk. The second one is risk neutral. Your preferences are such that you don't care much about risk. And the third one is risk loving. Your preferences are that you're a risk taker. Right? So the question here is, how do we consume under uncertainty? And from the point of view of the firm, the question is how do we can understand that behavior, right? And how, in a way, we can take advantage of it, right? To sell our goods. So a typical example here is insurance, right? You buy insurance because you're risk averse. If you were not risk averse, then you will not buy insurance, right? You'll be willing to take a gamble and potentially pay a high price, right? Because your preferences are such that you're a risk-loving person. But most of us are risk-averse. We get insurance
to avoid having huge payments to make under some unforeseen circumstances, right? So what we want to do is, in a way, right? You can think of possible situations in the future as unknown outcomes that you cannot predict. But you know that if you end up in one of these nasty situations, right, you might have a huge income loss. And you want to basically avoid that income loss. Why you want to avoid that income loss? So that your consumption, in a way, stays constant or similar across all those possible situations. So that concept is basically you want to smooth consumption over different states of the world. The world, a state in which you have, say, a health shock, you get unemployed, your house has floods, you have a problem with your car, things that can happen, right? That will make you incur an expenditure that potentially could be very big. Right? So you want to smooth that out, right? You want to avoid those things. Right? So what you typically do to do that is to buy an insurance. Right? You pay a premium, that is, you purchase a service, right? So that it is turned on when an eventuality happens. Right? So what are the insurance companies doing here? They're figuring out, right, how risk averse you are, and hence, by knowing how risk averse you are, they will figure out what is the right premium I'm going to charge you. Right? Because risk aversion will tell me how much you are willing to avoid risk. Risk that, in principle, right, is there. Avoid it in the sense of losing money. Right? So how much are you willing, are you prepared to pay to avoid this nasty eventuality? That gives me information about how risk averse you are, and hence how much are you willing to pay to buy this insurance. Right? So when you start thinking about pricing insurance, you always start thinking about try to figure out what is the risk aversion of potential consumers. So you can see the importance of this subject, right? From the point of view of another firm that doesn't sell insurance, think of, say, a consumer durable. You buy a car, right? So again, this is something that you're going to spend a lot of money in, and potentially, right, you're going to keep it for a long time. And you want reliability. So, again, how much you want to pay for higher reliability or lower reliability depends on how risk averse you are. Right? Again, this is something that the producer will want to know, right? And of course, this doesn't only apply to cars, it applies to any consumer durable, right? So you can see how the concept of risk aversion, or how risk averse are individuals, and knowing that is crucial for firms when deciding what to sell, right? So with these preliminaries, I'll stop, and I'll continue with this concept of risk aversion on Thursday. Okay? See you then.